Hello Rangers, and welcome to Ranger Ruby YouTube channel. In today's video, I'll be going over a brief history of the national parks. Let's go ahead and dive right on in. Before we begin, however, three things. One, this is a brief history of national parks, not the National Park Service. If it was the National Park Service, then we'd be starting in 1916, and we're definitely not doing that. Two, this list was not created and researched by me, but rather National Geographic, so they're cool. Go ahead and check them out. And three, this list was created by National Geographic for the National Park Service's centennial, which means that it only goes up to about 2016. If you would like any other more recent information, you can check out some of the videos on my channel, specifically last Tuesday's video, because I think it's pretty recent. But let's get on to the rest of the history. Starting in 1864 with President Abraham Lincoln signing the Yosemite Act, protecting the Mariposa Grove and Yosemite Valley. It is also the first law ever passed in the United States to protect the wild lands for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Then in 1968, John Muir arrives in Yosemite National Park for the first time. This might seem like it's a small deal, but it's a big deal because without John Muir, we wouldn't have literally the National Park Service. And then in 1869, the adventurous John Wesley Powell leads the first known expedition down the Colorado River, also known as the Grand Canyon. And then of course, on March 1st, 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signs Yellowstone Park Act into law, making Yellowstone America's first and the world's first national park. And then, over a decade later, on October 1st, 1890, Yosemite, Sequoia, and General Grant become some other of the earliest national parks. In 1899, Mount Rainier National Park is established as the first national park in the Pacific Northwest and is the first carved from a national forest reserve. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the American Antiquities Act, authorizing the establishment of national monuments by executive privilege. No congressional approval required, and this created many of the national monuments that we know and love today. In 1910, Glacier National Park was founded with over 125 glaciers in it. Less than a century later, there are only 25 glaciers in it. In December of 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signs legislation to dam the Tuolumne River and flood Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite National Park. And then on August 25th, 1916, the National Park Service is created with the passage of the Organic Act, drafted by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. For another fun fact, this dude also designed the layout of Central Park in New York City. And then a little less than a year later, in 1917, Stephen T. Mather becomes the head of the National Park Service with Horace M. Albright as his assistant. And then for the first time in 1920, annual visitation to the national parks exceeds 1 million visitors. In 1926, one of the first citizen campaigns among the residents of Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina pays for the $2.5 million for Shenandoah National Park and the $10 million for Great Smoky Mountains National Park. In 1929, wildlife biologist George Melendez Wright conceives of and personally funds for the first comprehensive survey advocating for a scientific approach to wildlife management inside the national parks. And then for the first time, for some reason, in 1930, the National Park Service hires its first historian. His name is Vern Chatelain. In 1933, a very important government reorganization transfers the War Department's battlefields, archaeological sites, historic sites, and parks in the nation's capital to the National Park Service. This expansion nearly doubles the number of units and visitors inside the National Park Service. In 1935, Congress directs the National Park Service to identify the nationally significant historic sites for consideration as parks and creates the first National Park System Advisory Board to advise the Secretary of the Interior for the designation of the first national historical sites. In 1941, a very important man steps inside and takes pictures of Yosemite National Park, and that would be Ansel Adams. In 1943, George Washington Carver becomes the first national park to celebrate the history of African Americans. In 1948, Hampton National Historic Site is solely recognized for its architectural significance, a designation that leads to the establishment for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. In 1956, a $5 billion 10-year program called Mission 66 begins. Its objective to upgrade facilities, staffing, and resource management throughout the national park system. And then in 1960, Ronald Lee develops the National Historic Landmark Program to expand the recognition and protection of nationally significant historic properties. In 1968, on an 800-acre site in Kings Canyon National Park, the National Park Service prescribes its first prescription burn. This is super important because it's how we keep ecosystems in the National Park Service healthy to this day. In 1972, Yellowstone National Park establishes its first centennial annual celebration, and the annual visitation exceeds 160 million visitors. Again, in 1972, the National Park Service creates Gateway, New York City, and Golden Gate, San Francisco, greatly expanding the urban presence of the National Park Service. In 1976, Congress establishes the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program. It has leveraged $69 billion in private investment towards the adaptive use of 400 prehistoric sites. In 1980, the birthplace of Martin Luther King Jr. becomes a National Historical Park. Again in 1980, Women's Rights National Historical Park is added to the system, commemorating women's struggle for equal rights. In 1988, an epic fire burns nearly 1/3 of Yellowstone National Park. The aftermath becomes a researcher's haven as the 3 decades of rejuvenation begin to unfold and are still researched today. In 1992, Manzanar memorializing the detention of Japanese citizens during World War II becomes the nation's first National Historic Site to interpret the difficult aspects of our nation's history. In 1995, wolves are reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park after a 70-year absence. The health of many other national park species begins to improve in ways that surprise visitors and scientists alike. In 2010, the National Park Service develops a climate change response strategy for addressing and lessening the effects of climate change that can be seen visibly inside national parks. And finally, in 2016, the National Park Service celebrates its 100th centennial birthday, marking a moment with a massive celebration called Find Your Park. A century later, there are over 400 units in the national park system, and this year marks the highest annual visitors to date. Well, everybody, that is the end in today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to give this video a huge thumbs up and comment down below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. Also, be sure to click that red subscribe button and little bell next one to always know when I post new videos. Thank you so much for watching again, and I shall see you next video. Bye!